This lecture is going to deal with Chapter 6, Rome, the Rise to Empire, circa 1000 BCE to 476 BCE. This is a pretty dense chapter, and there's a lot of information in here. So some of it that you see in the slides here may actually be left out. But I will deal with some very important issues from this era and hope to cover a lot of it. But of course you want to read Chapter 6 in its entirety. The history of Rome is pretty important. So Rome's early history is pretty interesting, and it actually presents quite some difficulties. The Romans themselves believe their history reached back to the 8th century BC with the founding. It would be nice if modern historians could easily agree, but unfortunately they can't. The Romans began to produce written sources, including histories of their past, only toward the end of the 3rd century BC. Those 3rd century writers must have relied on bare lists, called fasti, or office holders, and on a bare record of events that was kept by Rome's chief priest. And it was filled out by a lot of information that was handed on by word of mouth that typically changed over generations. The occasional scraps of quotations in later sources would arise, but a lot of the histories had been lost from the very, very beginning historical records of Rome. Archaeological evidence suggests that the territory of Rome was not permanently inhabited until about 1000 BC. The first people who settled around the Tiber Valley and in the area was later to become Rome were the Latins and the Sabines, two of the Indo-European peoples referred to collectively as Italians, who drifted down from the north across the Alps into the Italian peninsula at the close of the 2nd millennium BC. So from its Latin beginnings, Rome showed an extraordinary talent for adopting and adapting. They were really good at borrowing from the other cultures that had very dense artistic contributions and philosophical contributions. And two groups in particular that they borrowed from, one being the Etruscans and the second being the Greeks. Now the Etruscans were without a question the pivotal people of central Italy during the Archaic period, and owing their influence to Rome, Roman civilization was quite considerable. Now the Greeks, on the other hand, we can even see the contribution of Greek gods to the Roman adopting of the Greek gods. The Etruscans were a sophisticated culture, and they were themselves actually influenced by the Greeks as well, and they were masters of arts and technology. So the Roman Republic was a great deal more than just a set of governmental institutions. It embraced centuries of accumulated tradition, together with the societal bonds of law and religion. It was, in short, the history of the Roman Senate and people, words which provide perhaps the most evocative initials of European history, combining a Senate and a people. Information about the Roman Republic is considered more reliable than that for the earlier development of Rome. It is based principally on the written histories of the final half of the 1st century BC, which in turn derived from earlier written fragments, oral accounts, family traditions, and documents preserved in the form of inscriptions. In the early phases of the Republic, political power was held mainly by the patricians, the aristocrats of early Rome. And with the rise of power for Rome, there were inevitably wars. And of these wars, some of the most historically memorable are the Punic Wars. And the Punic Wars marked the beginning of Rome's imperial expansion and ended, well, the imperial expansion of Carthage. The ancient account of the Punic Wars survived kind of unevenly. Again, a lot of ancient history does have some discrepancies and some issues. For most detailed Greek and Roman historical works did not make it unscathed out of the Middle Ages. And those that treat the 3 Punic Wars are in a particularly unfortunate state. Only Polybius' first 5 books out of 40 are complete, although we do have sizable extracts from the rest. Livy, which we'll talk about him in a minute, gave an account of the Second Punic War. And then there was a historian by the name of Diodorus, and he wrote a world history, and it contains some excerpts for the centuries after 300 BC. And then Dio wrote a monumental history of Rome, and it presented excerpts in a Byzantine epitome for all the centuries before Cicero's and Caesar's. And so we have some of this time period captured historically that addresses the Punic Wars, but not a lot. The Punic Wars were 3 major campaigns that Rome waged to expand its empire. Messina, a present-day province of Sicily, Italy, was the site of the First Punic War, which began in 264 BC, when warring factions in the trade and transportation center called for assistance from both Carthage and Rome. The Carthaginians arrived first and secured the city, but the Romans, who had girded their navy for battle, arrived and drove the Carthaginians out, conquering Sicily, and Messina became a free city, but was allied with Rome. The Second Punic War was largely fought over the control of Spain, when the great Carthaginian general Hannibal captured the Roman allied city of Sagunto, Spain, in 218. He then crossed the Alps and invaded Italy, where he was met by and defeated the Roman armies. The deciding battle of the Second Punic War was fought in the North African town of Zama, southwest Carthage, in 202 BC. It was there that the Romans crushed the Carthaginians for good. Well, not for good, actually, because in the Third Punic War, in 149 BC, the Carthaginians rebelled against Roman rule. By 146 BC, Carthage, which had been richer and more powerful than Rome when the Punic Wars began, was completely destroyed, now this time for good, completely destroyed in this third and final conflict with the Roman army. Now the collapse of the Roman Republic is interesting, because in order for the Republic to collapse, in order for the empire to begin, the Republic had to collapse. And so the collapse of the Republic brought Rome's limited democratic practices to an end. Elites had always dominated with the center of Roman political life, but with the rise of Caesar and imperial Rome, the circle of those able to affect political change shrunk even further. It is all too easy to see the collapse of the Republic rising out of the rivalries of individuals, and they indeed played a vital role, but the part of the people is equally important. They passed the laws which bypassed the Senate. Also, with the wealth generated by the empire came social problems, the answers to which often damaged the interests of the very aristocracy that opposed the ambitions and tactics of reformers. The unwillingness to respond to such problems helped to create the environment necessary for the rise of the dynasts. The Civil War brought unprecedented upheaval to Italy and the provinces, and although none of the great figures of the late Republic, even Caesar, might have envisaged an autocratic government, Augustus had no such scruples. Following the fall of the Republic, Augustus, as emperor of the new Roman world, endeavored to develop Rome into a city more fitting as the capital for the new empire. Augustus was a very interesting character, and few would seriously question the claim that the age of the first Roman emperor Augustus was one of the pivotal periods of Western history, if not world history. The man who was granted the name Augustus by the Roman Senate on January 16, 27 BC, was born C. Octavius on September 23, 63 BC. During his long period in power, the Roman political landscape was radically transformed as what was in effect a monarch came to coexist alongside the traditional republican magistracies and organs of government. An absolute monarch distinguished by the form of a commonwealth, there was also a significant increase in the sheer territorial extent of the Roman Empire. While the system employed for administering Rome's provinces was substantially modified. Furthermore, a whole ideology or mythology developed that emphasized the birth of an entirely new order throughout the Roman world and celebrated the widespread return of peace and prosperity. And that era of peace and prosperity is known as the Pax Romana. Now this period is commonly referred to as the Pax Romana, which translates as Roman peace. Throughout these 2 centuries, Rome was in control of the entire Mediterranean region. Its lands were equal in size to the present United States. Its army provided security within the empire. The economy prospered. It was a time of peace and security. This centralized control, which existed during the reign of Augustus, created a rich world for the empire. Trade took place in every province, while goods passed freely throughout the Mediterranean world. Now, Roman law was a very interesting concept as well. In fact, we've learned a lot from Roman law, and it was necessarily a law of learned men, of the educated. So in the centuries after 1500, as in the Middle Ages, the history of Roman law was studied for kind of the history of its science. Not only did doctrines formulated by theorists with respect to specific legal problems direct the application of the law in daily practice, but the general attitude of the scholars toward Roman law both reflected and determined the degree to which this law was a working force in the intellectual life and the positive legal orders of the various states and periods. It was in the universities that the authority of Roman law as a system, embodying final truth for all times, was first shaken when the theory of natural law was developed, and when the merely relative character of Roman law as historical law was discovered. Now, you can't discuss Roman law, of course, without considering Roman philosophical thought at the time. And interestingly, there was no serious contribution of philosophy that was anywhere near what the Greeks contributed. And again, we know the Romans borrowed from the Greeks. We see this in one way. We definitely see it is in Roman Stoicism, which of course was a philosophical school that was developed under the Greeks. But Roman Stoicism was developed by Seneca. And Epictetus, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wrote Meditations. Many were moved by Marcus Aurelius's advice about restraining anger at his weak subjects, saying, "Do not be turned into Caesar or dyed by the purple, for that happens." Roman Stoicism was influential in the Renaissance and the modern period, and to this day it underlies codes of behavior and moral values in military communities. The basic Stoic premise is that we are obligated to understand the nature of the thing we deal with and be prepared to accept, without fuss, unwanted events that are not under our control. Epictetus is famous for saying that if your favorite clay pot breaks, you should remember that it was always fragile and not yours to begin with. And if your spouse or child dies, that's a reminder that, well, they're mortals. Something that we should always remember about the beings that we love. They're all going to die. Now, Seneca, most of his life was spent in public activities and in studying and writing. He had been a tutor to Nero. He was one of the most gifted writers of his generation, known for his tragedies as well as the prose works that are of greatest interest to historians of ideas. He was the next Roman thinker to make a significant contribution to the philosophical ideas drawn from the law. Unlike Cicero, Seneca was a professed Stoic, but this did not make him an unreflective transmitter of traditional Stoic arguments and doctrines. He was consistently ready to disagree with his own school and think through philosophical problems in an independent-minded manner. And of course, the Roman historians are really fascinating because historiography, as we know it, really took form and took shape in this period. So while there may not have been an extremely alarming contribution of philosophy from the Romans, there was in fact quite significant contribution of historiography. Namely, Titus Livius, aka Livy, who devoted half of his life to writing a long history of Rome consisting of 142 books, of which the war with Hannibal, that we mentioned before, comprises about 21, from books 21 to 30 out of those 142. Now, Livy took no part in politics, and consequently had no inside knowledge at his disposal, nor was he closely involved with the literary world of his time, which included the poets of Horace and Virgil. Unlike them, he mistrusted the prosperity of his age, considering its decadence the beginning of Rome's decline, and rightly so. Indeed, while Horace issued triumphalist prophecies of worldwide dominion, and Virgil occasionally fawned over Augustus, Livy noted the dangers that lurked over the horizon, which his fellow Romans preferred to ignore. Livy, the quintessential outsider, is still read because of his colorful descriptions of men and events and his arresting insights into human nature. Another contribution would be that of Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was neither an aristocrat or a general, and he came from a city that was actually 60 miles from Rome, so he wasn't even really Roman. He rose to the consulate, the highest office in Rome, not through heredity, or military success, or political connections, bribery, or violence, but through the sheer power of his voice. Cicero was the first, indeed, the only person to achieve such high office on the basis of his words alone. His chosen arena for the acquisition of distinction and power was the courts, and once he had achieved office and position, the Senate and the Forum. Achieved literary function, and his greatest success was his public capacity as an orator, and the most confident of his essays deal with oratory. Another great orator was that of Tacitus, who, during his adolescence, while the Roman world was convulsed in a civil war, Tacitus tells us he passionately pursued the traditional study of rhetoric and eagerly attached himself to the retinue of leading orators in the court, on the streets, and even in their houses. He regarded rhetorical training not merely as a bag of oratorical tricks, but as the acquisition of a profound literary culture, and he became a remarkably gifted orator. He saw that oratory was inevitably corrupted under tyranny, and like Polybius, he believed that history should be written and experienced by politicians. Tacitus certainly had the necessary qualifications as a historian: psychological insight, political acumen, access to sources, a command of supple and subtle style, and a wide literary culture. In the 2 decades after his consulship, Tacitus produced 5 books which demonstrate his increasing historical sophistication and stylistic virtuosity. Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, produced a very interesting work that, in a lot of ways, seems to be very similar to and based on Homer's great epics in the broadest structure. And Virgil's Aeneid is actually central to our understanding of Roman culture and of Western literature generally. The story that Virgil tells is a story that covers a year of Aeneas' life, but through the use of flashbacks to past events and prophecies of the future and other literary distortions of time, Virgil makes his poem embrace all of Roman history. So, in a sense, he is creating a work of, fiction that likewise is historical narrative, which some people say the same thing about, or at least the style of literature that Luke wrote. Was he a theologian, or was he a historian? Was he writing about, a real guy named Jesus, or was he just making a historical document, or maybe he was contributing to the myth of Jesus, some might suspect, but he was also writing a very historical narrative, kind of similar in some ways, but the story covers this year of Ananias' life. In essence, the poem is a foundation story, like the foundation stories of other nations that we see, such as maybe the Pilgrim Fathers of the U.S., or the Maori tales of travelers arriving by canoe in New Zealand. And the epic in Virgil's Aeneid presents the memorable poetic form and a myth about the foundation of the Roman nation by its settlers from the east who, through a combination of alliances and military supremacy, established themselves in Italy in obedience to the commands of Jupiter, the king of the gods. And of course, we cannot neglect the contribution of lyric poetry and literature. Catullus wrote lyric poetry. And what we know from the fragments and the collections of his texts that remain is that, for one, he was extremely original, and his choice of arrangements of words and rhythms, the grammatical variations, the figures of speech, the information conveyance, the thematic structure, and all these evidence of craftsmanship show that he was very original. And even though we have some fragments of other writers of lyric poetry from this time, there's no doubt that Catullus was definitely the leader of the school and by far the primary example of this style. And then we have Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Publius Ovidius Naso was admired by Shakespeare, and he was a poet who wrote about everything from adultery and abortion to divorce and seduction. One of his most famous poems is that of Metamorphoses, which is a poem of over 12,000 lines divided into 15 books. In the opening lines, or prologue of the Metamorphoses, Ovid declares that he's going to tell of a metamorphosis, which is a Greek word, basically means when forms change into other bodies, beginning with the creation of the world, coming down to his own time, and then in the next 11,982 lines, he carries out the program so tersely described in the prologue. He goes from creation of the world, from chaos, which was the first metamorphosis, and then he follows with a purgative flood, and then the recreation of the world and the human race. These two parts serve as introduction to the body of the poem, which is 3 long sections. The first, more or less, is on the gods, the second on heroes and heroines, and the third on historical personages. The last section begins Troy and the Trojan War, and ends with the Emperor Augustus in Ovid's own time. In a brief epilogue, Ovid asserts the lasting value of his poem. By the end of the poem, everything that exists, almost, appears to either to have undergone metamorphosis or is undergoing continuous change. Of course, we cannot forget the works of satire, Horace and Juvenal, to be specific. But satire is defined as literature in which vice and folly or certain human weaknesses are held up to ridicule, often with the purpose of instigating reform. Satire is irony or derision or caustic wit. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's just almost morbid, but it's used to attack or expose this folly, vice, or stupidity. Now, highly characteristic of Roman satire is the presence of the persona or mask of the author. it is not always easy to distinguish between the poetic eye of literature and what might have been the actual beliefs or experiences of the author. But when we look back at this period of Roman satire, Horace and Juvenal were considered pillars of the genre. Some criticism of satire is that it was an artless realism of Roman satire, and that it was like a literary fiction because it's been excluded from classic discussions of poetic diction on the ground that language is too close to everyday speech.